I was changing my father's catheter bag at 2 in the morning when my phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I almost didn't look. I'm glad I did. It was a text my mother had sent to my brother by mistake, meant for someone else. A photo of a deed, already signed, already notarized, with 5 words underneath it. "Welcome home, baby. It's yours." I stood there in the hallway light with rubber gloves still on my hands in the house I had paid for every single month for 12 years, and I read those 5 words 3 times. I didn't cry. I didn't drop the phone. I just stood very still. The way you do right before a wave hits, when your body already knows something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. Welcome back to the Family Revenge Tales. My name is Claire Whitfield. I'm 38 years old, and for 12 years I sent $1,400 a month on a mortgage I would never own a single brick of. I want to tell you exactly how that happens to a person, because if you've ever been the one who shows up, the one who pays, the one who says, "I've got it," before anyone even finishes asking, I think you already know. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens one reason-be request at a time until reasonable becomes a leash. And the worst part is you tie the knot yourself, out of love, a little tighter every year, and you don't feel it tightening because you're too busy being needed. I grew up in a brick 2-story on Maple Hollow Road outside Lansdale, Pennsylvania. There were 2 of us, me and my younger brother Tyler. I was born responsible. He was born lucky. Our mother, Linda, used to say it like it was sweet. Claire came out of the womb 30 years old. It took me until I was 36 to understand that wasn't a compliment. It was a job assignment, handed to me before I could talk, and I spent the next 3 decades fulfilling it without anyone ever asking if I wanted the job. When my father, Walter, had his first heart scare at 58, the mortgage was 4 months behind and the bank had already sent the second warning letter. I had just gotten promoted at the insurance company where I worked, and I had savings nobody else in my family had ever managed to keep. So I did what I always did. I covered it. I told myself it was temporary, a bridge until Dad's health stabilized and he could go back to work. I remembered the exact moment temporary started to feel permanent. It was my 30th birthday. I told my mother weeks ahead that Mark and I were taking a long weekend in Cape May. Just the 2 of us. The first real trip we'd planned in years. 2 days before we left, she called, crying, saying the furnace had died and they had no way to fix it before the cold snap. I canceled the trip. I drove up with my checkbook instead of a suitcase. Nobody in my family ever asked how the birthday was. They asked if the furnace was fixed. I told myself that was fine. I told myself a lot of things were fine that year. Tyler, meanwhile, drifted. A semester of college here, a failed food truck there, 2 engagements that fell apart before the invitations went out. Every time he landed somewhere new, my mother called it finding himself. Every time I sent another payment, she called it just helping out a little since you're doing so well. Doing well, as if the money fell from a tree I happened to be standing under, instead of coming out of a paycheck I earned by sitting in a cubicle for 9 hours every day for over a decade, while Mark and I put off having kids because we couldn't afford both a baby and my parents' roof. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into a marriage when one partner is quietly bleeding money into someone else's life. Mark never told me to stop. He asked me once, gently, on our 10th anniversary, sitting in the dark in our car outside a restaurant we couldn't really afford to be at that month because I'd just sent an extra payment to cover Tyler's car insurance. "Claire," he said, "when does it end?" I didn't have an answer. I just remember staring at the restaurant's neon sign, blurring through the windshield, and feeling something in my chest go very tight, the way it does right before you're about to cry, and you decide instead not to. 5 years ago, my father had the stroke that took most of his speech and half his strength on his right side. After that, temporary stopped being a word anyone used at all. I moved in close. Not all the way, but 3 or 4 nights a week, sometimes more, managing his medications, driving him to physical therapy, learning how to read his eyes when his mouth couldn't form the words anymore. I remember the first time I changed his catheter bag alone, my hand shaking, my father watching the ceiling because he couldn't watch my face, both of us pretending this wasn't the most humbling thing either of us had ever lived through. I remember him gripping my wrist afterward, hard, the only way he had left to say thank you, and how that single gesture meant more to me than anything my mother had said in years. My mother stayed in that house too, of course, but real caretaking, the kind that smells like antiseptic and sounds like a man trying to say your name and not quite getting there, fell to me. Tyler visited on holidays. He posted a photo every Father's Day captioned, "Love ya, Pop," and the comments underneath always said things like, "You're such a good son." Nobody commented under the nights I actually spent there because nobody saw them. Caretaking doesn't post well. One Thanksgiving, Tyler showed up late, charming as ever, and made a toast about family always taking care of family. And my mother cried happy tears and squeezed his hand, and I sat there with dish soap still drying on my fingers from doing everyone's plates, and I smiled and said nothing, because that's what I always did. I told myself silence was strength. I didn't understand yet that it was just a different kind of exhaustion. I want to tell you about my grandmother, because she's the reason any of this came out the way it did. Her name was Eleanor, my mother's mother, and she lived 2 streets over until she passed 18 months ago at 91. Eleanor was sharp in a way that skipped my mother entirely and landed, I think, on me. The last time I saw her fully lucid, about 2 weeks before she passed, she held my hand with a grip stronger than you'd expect from someone so small, and she said, "Claire, honey, you've been holding this family up by yourself for so long, you've forgotten you're allowed to be tired." I told her I was fine. She looked at me the way grandmothers do when they know you're lying and decide to let you have the lie for now. "Just remember," she said, "I see everything. I always have." I thought that was just something old women say. I didn't understand what she meant until the night of that text message. I didn't confront anyone right away. That's not who I am, and by that point I'd learned that confrontation in my family never landed the way it should. My mother had a gift for turning any accusation back into evidence of my own coldness, so I did the thing I'm good at. I went quiet, and I went looking for the truth. I called the county recorder's office the next morning on my lunch break, sitting in my car in the parking garage at work so no one would hear me. It took 3 days, but I got the answer I already suspected. The house had been refinanced 8 months earlier, quietly, and the new deed listed Tyler Whitfield as sole owner, effective immediately upon recording. My name wasn't anywhere on it. It never had been. I called my mother that evening and asked her, calmly, why she hadn't told me. "It's not really something you needed to be involved in, honey," she said. "It's still family. It stays in the family." "I've been paying for it for 12 years, Mom." There was a pause, and then she said the sentence I think I'll hear in my sleep for the rest of my life. "Tyler needed a fresh start, Claire. You've always been so stable. You never needed anything from us." As if stability were a punishment. As if 12 years of sacrifice were simply proof I'd never required gratitude in the first place. I didn't yell. I said, "Okay, Mom," and hung up, and sat in my kitchen with my hands flat on the counter, breathing, while Mark watched from the doorway, not saying anything, just waiting to see what I needed. What I needed arrived 4 days later, in a manila envelope from a law office in Doylestown I had never heard of. Inside was a letter addressed to me and a flash drive and a short cover note from an attorney named Robert Hines explaining that my grandmother had retained him 11 months before her death to handle a private matter she didn't want shared until the appropriate moment presents itself, which Mrs. Whitfield assured me Claire would recognize when it came. I sat in my car again and pressed play. My grandmother's voice filled the space, steady and clear. "This is Eleanor Whitfield recording this statement with my attorney present for my granddaughter Claire," she said. "If you're hearing this, somebody in this family has finally pushed you further than even you can swallow quietly. I've watched you carry your mother and father for years while your brother floated through life, and I've watched your mother praise him for breathing and overlook you for bleeding yourself dry. I want you to know I saw it, every bit of it." She explained that years earlier, before my father's first crisis, she had loaned my parents $40,000 to help cover an even older mortgage default, long before I believed I alone had solved that problem at 26. She had never told me, out of respect for my mother's wishes, foolishly, for longer than she should have. But she'd kept records, a signed promissory note, notarized, never repaid. And she'd added a private clause almost as an afterthought. If the house was ever sold, refinanced, or transferred to anyone other than the person who had paid down the majority of the mortgage debt, the $40,000 loan would become immediately due to her estate with 18 years of accrued interest. "That money is yours now, Claire," her voice said, "not as charity, as payment, finally, for everything you were never thanked for. Use it or don't. That's your choice. But you've earned the right to stop being quiet." I cried then, for the first time since this all started. Not from grief, but from the strange, overwhelming relief of being seen by someone, after years of feeling invisible in my own family. The note was real, fully enforceable. With Tyler now holding sole title, the transfer had triggered exactly the clause Eleanor built in. The estate, meaning functionally me, since Eleanor had named me sole executor and primary beneficiary, was owed just over $81,000, due within 60 days, secured against the house Tyler now legally owned. I sat my parents and Tyler down at the same kitchen table where I'd done my homework as a child and laid out copies of every document. Tyler went pale. My mother kept insisting it had to be a mistake until Mr. Hines, sitting beside me, calmly confirmed Eleanor had done this on purpose with full legal counsel, specifically anticipating this outcome. "You signed away the house I paid for to give to the son who never paid for anything," I said quietly. "And it turns out the one person in this family who was actually paying attention the whole time was Grandma." Tyler didn't have the money. In the end, the only way to satisfy the note within the deadline was to sell the house. After the bank and the debt to Eleanor's estate were settled, just over $90,000 remained, and the will was clear about where it went if a dispute like this ever arose. It went to me. My parents moved into a modest senior apartment near my house, a place I help with now, openly, on my terms, with a number I agreed to and revisit every year, not a number that quietly grew in the dark for over a decade. Tyler sent one furious voicemail calling me selfish. I let it go unanswered because for the first time in my life, I didn't feel obligated to manage someone else's feelings about consequences they created themselves. A few weeks after everything settled, I drove out to the cemetery alone on a gray Sunday morning, the kind with low clouds and not much wind. I sat by Eleanor's headstone for a long time, the letter from her attorney folded in my coat pocket, and I read her recorded words over again in my head, the part where she said she'd always seen me. I told her, out loud that I was sorry it took losing everything for me to finally believe her. I told her I was tired, the way she'd said I was allowed to be. And for the first time in 12 years, sitting there in the cold with no one watching and nothing left to prove, I let myself cry without apologizing for it to anyone, including myself. I think about her almost every day now. Not just the woman with sweet tea on the porch, but the version of her who sat in a lawyer's office at 90 years old, quietly building a trap door under a house just in case the people she loved ever did exactly what she feared they would do. She didn't lecture my mother while she was alive. She simply made sure the truth had somewhere to land, even after she was gone. If there's someone in your life who's been the steady one for far too long, the one who pays, who shows up, who never gets thanked because everyone assumes they don't need thanking, go check on them tonight. Not in 6 weeks, tonight. And if you are that person, I hope this story reminds you that you're allowed to set the rope down and that someone, somewhere, is paying closer attention than you think. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and join the Family Revenge Tales family. We tell stories about people who carried too much for too long and what happens when the truth finally gets to speak for itself. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been the one who paid while someone else got the reward? Being needed is not the same thing as being valued, and the two get confused in families more often than anyone wants to admit. This story carries an important lesson about boundaries. Love does not require self-erasure, and steady people deserve to be seen, protected, and thanked, not simply relied upon until they break. It's also a reminder to document what you give, financially and emotionally, because clarity protects you even when the people around you would rather you stay confused. Finally, it shows that justice doesn't always arrive loudly or immediately. Sometimes it waits patiently in the hands of someone who was watching all along until the moment it's needed most.